Brothers, sisters, friends, enemies, and neutrals, I got a couple of lightweight rhymes I'm going to read first, and then I'm going to say something about the upcoming election and especially the governor's race, because I support Carol Blood, who is running. She's a Democrat. I don't belong to either party. I never belonged to any party, but she was my seatmate for a number of years in the legislature. She is a very intelligent woman. She speaks her mind and she has a good mind. She analyzes legislation. She has principle. You know where she is on issues, and nobody would be able to buffalo or bully her. Now, one of the things that shows how dumb these Republicans are, who are making these ads against Tony Vargas, who is running against Bacon, and Bacon is bad for your health. I'm going to vote for Tony. The ones who make these advertisements are a national company. They say that Vargas wants to take money from the public to double his salary. First of all, senators only make $12,000 a year. We had no insurance, no hospitalization, no pension. And we, as members of the legislature, could not raise our salary. It is in the Constitution, and it would take a constitutional amendment to raise the salary, which was done over a decade ago. But in pushing for the minimum wage increase, that issue is on the ballot. I voted for it. I support it. There is discussion, correct, about the fact that the amounts that people make now are not enough to sustain a family. Well, senators, when you consider the number of hours, don't make minimum wage. So the only ones who can get in the legislature and stay there are rich people, lobbyists who are paid by somebody to do their dirty work, and the ordinary people cannot make it because they can't afford it. I stayed there because when I first went in, I was barbering. Then I spent so much time in the legislature that I no longer barbered. But I didn't have little children that I had to take care of in my later years there. So I was able to scrape by, but I never was in it for money. Never have I had a big car. I don't buy expensive clothes. I wear the things of this world loosely. There are no material things that I want other than what it takes to survive. So many things were said against Senator Vargas, which were outright lies or showed the ignorance of the people saying those things. But let me get to this lightweight rhyme. Then I'm going to read an editorial that the World Herald wrote in endorsing Carol Blood. This is called "Thus saith the Lord." But on the other hand, when I was younger, I was a churchgoer. I believed the Bible just as it was written. I even called it the Bible. Now it's the Bible. I use my judgment. There are a lot of fables, a lot of lies, a lot of murder, incest, treachery, any kind of bad thing you want to find, and the Bible is a bloody book. But it's called "Thus saith the Lord," but on the other hand. And the ones speaking on the other hand are the Christians. Jesus said, "Pray secretly and not out in the street." Christians say, to hell with that. Public prayer is my meat, and they prove it in the legislature. Jesus said, "God knows thy need before you even ask it." Christians say, that can't be true, for empty is my basket. Jesus said, "Thine enemy love, for God is pleased by this." Christians say, that makes no sense. Who would a cobra kiss? Jesus said, "Who takes thy coat should also have thy cloak." Christians say, get out of here, for certainly you joke. Jesus said, if one compels 1 mile, go with him twain. Christians say, if I did that, I'd have to be insane. Jesus said, sell what you have and help the wretched poor. Christians say, that's cutting close. You'll soon be out that door. Jesus said, thy cheek was struck, then offer up the other. Christians say, I'd take my gun and blow away the mother. Jesus said, to all who crave salvation, it is free. Christians say, a gold mine's in the gospel on TV. Jesus said, respect thy wife. You two should be as one. Christians say, it's obvious of marriage you've had none. Jesus said, take up the cross and humbly follow me. Christians say, you surely jest and laugh uproariously. Jesus said, from all thy words, it seems in vain I died. Christians say all troublemakers should be crucified. Jesus hung his head in sadness, turned away, and then Christians say, if you come back, we'll nail you up again. Here is the editorial that appeared in Sunday's World Herald. Its headline, Carol Blood would be constructive leader as Nebraska governor. Nebraska's next governor will face significant challenges, overhauling the way our state pays for schools and government services, ensuring that our workforce is large enough and educated enough to maintain a growing economy. Wrestling with the contentious abortion debate is something that is going to have to be dealt with. Dealing with these thorny issues and much more during the next 4 years will require sound leadership. It will take an ability to hear and understand the diverse views of Nebraskans, balance differing interests, and ultimately find ways to bring the state together as it moves forward. Right now, there is so much division in this state because Republicans, I call them Republicans, follow whatever their national leaders say. Much that is said on the national level is based on disinformation, misinformation, outright lies. But these fools in Nebraska echo them. They talk about the federal government being too big. But then when their crops don't come in, who do they look to for subsidies? And where do subsidies come from? Taxpayers' money. But the farmers have their hands out saying, subsidize our farms, buy our products, prop us up, guarantee us a living. If there's a drought and they have trouble paying their loans, they want that big government to step in and take it from there and help them out again. If there's a flood, they want the Corps of Engineers, a federal operation, other help meets from the government, that big hateful government, the hated government in Washington is pleaded with by these Nebraskans. They talk without thinking. They are not well educated. They don't understand things, and they cut off their nose to spite their face because there are big shot Republicans in Washington who laugh at these hickey-filed hillbillies out here. Oh, I know it's flatland, but hillbilly is a term that can apply to anybody who is a hayseed, who is a sucker, who buys these patent medicines and will let the wool be pulled over their eyes. Farmers and Nebraska could not make it without the help of the federal government. But you'll hear the federal government criticized and condemned by these fools. Carol Blood is above all of that. She would know how to pull people together. She understands the issues. She cannot be bought out. Oh, and she certainly cannot be frightened out. The next governor is not going to be just responsible for Nebraskans from one party or one area of this state. With fewer than 2 million people, Nebraska is too small to waste any of its residents' talents or discourage anyone from living here. Our governor needs to keep up to the task of getting all of the people pulling in the same direction. That skill is one of the things, when the word "we" shows up in this editorial, they mean the editorial board of the World Herald. That skill is one of the things we were looking for in making an editorial endorsement in the governor's race between Republican Jim Pillen and Democrat Carol Blood. Newspapers, including this one, have long made such endorsements, but we don't do this to tell people what to think. Our readers are too smart for that. Laughing behind their hand. The reason we endorse is to provide helpful input to voters. We feel an obligation to share with our readers what we've learned over many years of observing and reporting on public affairs. We hope to offer some nonpartisan information and perspective in an electoral process filled with many influences, some of them aggressively partisan. In Nebraska, that's exactly what all of it is. Put an R in front of somebody's name for Republican, and these people flock to that person. You could put the R on a jackass, and that jackass would get votes. And the jackass would be smarter than some of the people who have two legs and look down on a jackass. This one jackass was hitched to a wagon, and this guy said, "I'm gonna show you how stupid this jackass is. I'm gonna build a fire under him." So the guy built the fire under the jackass, and guess what the jackass did? He walked forward until the wagon was over the fire. When the wagon caught fire, the jackass walked away without having a load. And the smart alecky farmer had next to nothing to make a point. The World Herald's news articles about campaigns and candidates strive to be even-handed. In contrast, an editorial endorsement necessarily takes a stand. Still, we want our editorial opinions to be grounded in facts and thoughtful content. So, we meet with the candidates themselves to take the measure of their ideas and temperaments, to see how they defend their policies and respond to alternative ideas, and also to see if they even have any significant policies. Blood met with us, but Pillen rebuffed us, something that major candidates rarely have done. His no-show was not entirely surprising, given that Pillen also refused to debate with Blood or before the May primary with his fellow Republican candidates. Pillen cannot defend his position. He doesn't know very much. His ignorance would be obvious. His weakness would be obvious. So it's clear that if he becomes governor, he's going to be the tool in the hands of whatever powerful entities want to run this state and ruin this state. We said in the primary that Pillen was wrong to shun debates or other forums where his positions could be scrutinized and, yes, sometimes challenged. If you're not able to stand up for your ideas, except in safe spaces like small groups of friendly voters or scripted campaign ads, how do Nebraskans know that you are prepared for this important job? Now, Bacon is silly. He was in the military. That was yesterday, and yesterday's gone. Well, you know what he had on when I saw one of his ads today? One of his old military jackets. I guess to connect him up with the concept of military action going on in the world, that he is a strong, upstanding, outstanding, fighting man, defender of everybody against the forces of evil. But he has kind of grown a bit and his jacket hasn't. So it doesn't really have the fit that it should. And he looks more like somebody going out for Halloween without a mask than a military man who can be relied on to meet the enemy and overcome that enemy by any means necessary. Let me continue. Excuse me. If you're not able to stand up for your ideas, except in safe spaces like small groups of friendly voters or scripted campaign ads, how do Nebraskans know that you're prepared for the important job? Pillen's campaign told us that he was not going to meet with our editorial board since we had endorsed blood in the primary. In parentheses, we had not, which shows how uninformed he and his handlers are, and criticized him in the past a bit. As a result, they felt it was inevitable that we would endorse blood in the general election. No, it was evident to them that blood would get the endorsement because she had more on the ball than he has. Continuing. Far from it. Before this year, the World Herald had endorsed Republican candidates for governor in 10 of the last 11 races, including the past 6 straight elections. We endorsed Pillen's top supporter, Governor Pete Ricketts, twice, even though we had criticized him from time to time. We had an open mind about Pillen, who met with us via, however you pronounce it, Zoom in April when we were considering our Republican primary endorsement. A former Husker football player, Pillen should have been willing to take the field this fall and show Nebraskans through debates and endorsement interviews what he was made of. Instead, he's chosen to forfeit in those situations, and we're disappointed about that. But we're pleased to endorse Carol Blood, a state senator from Sarpy County. We were impressed with her knowledge of issues, her thoughtful perspective, and her commitment to bringing people together to solve problems. That's what I observed about her in the legislature. We'd have our impromptu discussions. Now she sat, I stood all the time, but we discussed things and we differed on issues, but we differed from the standpoint of principle, not just because she said it and I don't like what she said because I don't like her. None of that. Continuing. As a Democrat in a legislative body dominated by Republicans, Blood has by necessity learned how to work with others to get anything done. She understands that successful solutions come from keeping the focus on people and policy, not party. She's right that Nebraska needs to go beyond rhetoric and platitudes to make progress on things like workforce development. Nebraska leaders have talked for decades about the trends that now have helped leave the state short of workers, yet failed to create a comprehensive, effective plan to fill those jobs. And there's so much racism, there's discrimination against the LGBTQ plus community, the Native Americans. The racism is so thick, you could cut it with a knife. And they want to deny the racism. Some of these yahoos don't even want there to be sex education in the schools. They say leave it to the parents. The parents, by and large, are ignorant. They don't know anything. They can't explain things to their children. When I was in the legislature, I was the most popular senator among high school and grade school kids. And the high schoolers would tell me, even some in the upper grades of grade school, they couldn't talk to their parents about sex because First of all, they were embarrassed. Secondly, when they would talk, they didn't know anything. So they went out and they experimented. There is an appropriate, obviously, way to discuss sex with students. You're not going to use the F word like their parents might use or like they themselves might use. Education is designed to shape and develop the mind, not channel people in one direction toward a narrow set of goals. The best education will lead a person to question, question, and question. When I traveled around the country to various universities, from coast to coast, literally, New York, Texas, Florida, Colorado, California, Washington State, and places in between, I always insisted that there be time left for questions from the audience. And people would say, well, we've read some of the things you say. You sure you want to talk to the audience? I said, that's what I'm going to do. I came here to talk to them, but I like to let them talk back to me or ask me questions. I would explain, as Malcolm X said, the only stupid question is the one that is not asked. There must be that meeting of minds, that sometimes clashing of minds. Iron sharpens iron. When everybody is programmed to say the same thing, there can be no progress. That's why Nebraska trails every place. I don't believe anybody on either coast, when they discuss, if they do, with their children, where they would advise them to consider living if they want to move. I doubt that many of them will say Nebraska. And you all know that's true. Some of you want to get out of here as quickly as you can. The state is backward. I've stayed here a long time because there always has to be somebody. The Bible spoke of a remnant, somebody who's going to try to make things better, to stir people's minds, to try to improve the education offerings in the schools, to try to ensure that the people who stand in front of those students in the classroom know their subject matter, not where they're going to teach people to just repeat what they hear and grade them on the basis of how well they regurgitate what they were fed. Some of you all have heard that song by Pink Floyd called Just Another Brick in the Wall. Those kids say in their British accent, we don't need no education. Mm-mm-mm. Mm-mm-mm. We don't need no thought control. Mm-mm-mm. Mm-mm-mm. No dark sarcasms in the classroom. Mm-mm-mm. Mm-mm-mm. Teacher, leave them kids alone. Hey, teacher, leave them kids alone. Then the refrain, all we are is just another brick in the wall. And then when the whole song is over, you hear this guy with the heavy British accent hollering, take your seats. If you don't take your seats, you can't have any pudding. You cannot have any pudding if you don't take your seats. But the message is clear, and it's a problem everywhere. Children, young people, when their minds are active, they're hungry to be fed, not trash. That's when they get the least, because the people who teach often don't know anything. They're offering a party line. In America, children are not to be taught about slavery. The carryovers from it are in place today. And the US Supreme Court is doing all it can to re-entrench the old, what they call the good old days of slavery. They can't get that far, but the discrimination, the segregation, and the attempt, to the extent that they can do it, deprive Black people, other people, they say of color, Latinos, Latinx, Native or Indigenous people of an education. A mind is a terrible thing to waste. A mind is a dangerous thing to sharpen and hone when you're going to do the wrong thing toward the one who has that mind. But let me continue. Oh, one of the things that would happen invariably in articles where I was being assessed, now that I'm out of the legislature, I've started reading papers, and I see why people think I was a genius compared to what's out there. But they talked about how I educated, I informed, I challenged, I criticized, I analyzed, I extrapolated, I theorized. In other words, served the role and function of a teacher. No bill came before the legislature that I had not read. And if it was a technical subject, which was unfamiliar to me, but it dealt with not just a narrow area over here for a specialized group. I don't mean based on lobbyists, but it's a specialized area. Then that was something I didn't have to spend a lot of time on. The lobbyists would battle it out and they take care of that. But if it was anything that impacted the public at large, I made sure that I was informed. That's what books are for. That's what libraries are for. That's what your brain is for. And these things ought to be utilized. I told them, I often feel that I'm guilty of child abuse in this legislature when I deal with you all. There's no way I could be a part of a body where there were 48 people and one white person, and we were so backward that to handle that white person, we had to try to pass rules so his or her ability could not manifest itself. That's what they tried to do with me, but they never could stop me. They were always a day late and $1 short. They forgot the story of the 3 little pigs. When the wolf finally had blown down the house of straw, the house of wood, of sticks, and they were in the house made of stone, and he couldn't blow that down. He's going to trick them. Let's go get some apples. They said, okay, where are the apples? He said, well, I'll show you. I'll come by your house at 8 o'clock. Well, they knew where their apples were. But by the wolf saying the time he was going to come by, they knew how much time they had to go get their apples and get home. So when the wolf came, they said, oh, we've already been there. Everything the wolf planned to do, the pigs were an hour early. So they always had accomplished it by the time the wolf got there. So he was going to be brilliant. He's going to go up on the roof and come down the chimney. Well, he was making so much racket that the pigs figured what he was doing. So, and I'm just throwing the story together the way it was in general. They got a huge kettle, built a fire under it in the fireplace. When the wolf climbed and came down the chimney, unlike Santa Claus getting a warm welcome, the wolf was boiled and the pigs won. And maybe that's what bacon is going to do. Doesn't bacon come from a pig? You know, the 2 traits or characteristics that mark bacon. Bacon is slick and greasy and bad for your health. Let me finish this editorial. The editorialist was talking about the keeping a workforce here and so forth. Part of Blood's plan is PK through 14 approach to education, ensuring that children get a good start in life with pre-kindergarten and are able to get up to a 2-year degree in college that prepares them for jobs in the trades, information technology, healthcare, or other fields. That's if they're going to be workers and want to make a good living. Some want to be scientists. Some want to be doctors, lawyers, nurses. Blood also touts another lawmaker's proposal in the legislature that would have used a 1 cent increase in the sales tax to fund schools and reduce property taxes. I would have fought that. Sales taxes are what you call regressive. They put the same burden on every individual, regardless of his or her ability to pay. When these taxes are put on people who have next to nothing, that little next to nothing is taken too. I fought against every sales tax. Tax those who have the most, the rich, but everybody leaves them alone except me. But I was one vote. I could stop those things, but I couldn't pass a program by myself. But when it came to the death penalty, I finally was able to persuade, not alone, this was a joint effort, but provide the leadership that led Nebraska not only to abolish the death penalty, but to override the governor's veto. This man is a Catholic. He was called by former Governor Kay Orr a man of faith when he was running for office, and she was supporting him. His faith is Catholic. Well, the catechism, the official teaching of the church, the position of the Pope is against the death penalty in all cases, without exception. Well, what happened here? The rich man, his father made the money, not this one who's in office is not too sharp at all. He used his father's money to fund a petition drive to reinstate the death penalty, and that was successful. They can't beat me one-on-one. They had to spend millions of dollars, and they had to get the statewide voters to undo what I had achieved in the legislature. They had to change their method of governing to get me out of the legislature by means of term limits. They acknowledged my greatness, and I hate to boast. Well, I'm not boasting, I'm just telling the truth. I'm 1 out of 49, but I had such power in that legislature. I set the agenda for so many years. I stopped so much bad legislation, not every bad bill, obviously, but stopped so much of it. I was the check and the balance in that legislature, and by extrapolation, in the state. I kept an eye on the courts and on the governor, and they didn't mess with me. And I have the record to prove it. And the white people frankly stated that as long as he runs for office, the people in his area are going to put him in office. And you know what he does? He controls this legislature. Well, if I'm one man, which I am, and there are 48 of them, shouldn't they be ashamed to say that this one black man in a racist state dominates the other 48 to such an extent that the only way we can get what we want is to change the Constitution, the fundamental law of this state, so that we can get him out of there? That's what they did. I mocked them while they were getting the petitions together to put it on the ballot. When it got on the ballot, I mocked them. I said, you all are acknowledging my greatness by saying you're willing to term limit all of these 48 people to get rid of one black man. And when you get me out, and I sit out 4 years, I'll be back, which occurred. I did go back. I was the first one to come back after being limited, and I was the first one who was term limited twice. To mock them. And it wasn't just to put them down, but to stir their pure minds. They weren't pure. That's a figure of speech. I told them, and I've said it during this program, you all have made me your God. The book of Revelations supposedly quotes God saying, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. I said, I am your Alpha, the first, because I'm the first one to be term limited out and come back. There can only be one first. I am your Omega, the last, because due to term limits, I'm the last person who will serve 46 years in this legislature. So by being the Alpha and the Omega of the legislature, I am the God of this legislature. They nicknamed me the King Cobra because I told them the cobra wastes no venom on dead or fleeing things. So if there was a bill and they're squabbling among themselves, there's no need for me to be a part of it. And if there was one that needed some work done on it to protect the public, then I was in the middle of that. And I would tell them when they would get in a tizzy, the louder the viper's hiss, the closer I'm striking to their nest. So hiss on. And they knew they could not intimidate me. They could not bully me. My work was going to go on no matter what they did or did not do, because I had an inner compass. My direction came from my principles, not what somebody outside of me said or thought or claimed to think about me or what I'm doing. Did that mean I didn't listen? Oh, no. What I had a way of doing was to get somebody into a discussion and get them worked up, and then I don't talk. And then they just, everything in them tumbles out. But when they're angry and speaking in anger, they speak without thinking. And when you speak without thinking, you don't recollect what you said. So at another time, because my Rolodex is recording it, I will give back to them what they gave to me, and they think I'm a mind reader. No, I understand human nature. I listen, I remember, I file things away, and I use them when it's to my advantage and when I want to show people that I know more about you than you know about yourself. Am I revealing trade secrets that would weaken and hinder me if I decide at some point to go back into the legislature? Every heavyweight boxer and boxers in every division studied Muhammad Ali. They knew what he could do and they knew what he would do, but they couldn't stop him. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. You can't hit what you can't see. It didn't matter to me that they knew the way I operated. I would remind them that everything we do is in a fishbowl. Everybody can watch me. Everybody can see what I do. They can see how I do it. But you don't have the get up. You don't have the drive. You have people pulling strings on you, dictating to you. And you know what ought to be said, but you're afraid to speak. So you keep skid chains on your tongue. And nobody is going to make me quiet when I think I ought to speak. Nobody is going to make me speak when I decide that it's a time for me to be quiet. I always have a plan of my own, and I work my plan pursuant to my schedule, so they can never provoke me to do or say something I had no intention of doing or saying. I knew what they were. I knew what I was dealing with, and I knew how to deal with them. They enshrined me in their constitution by getting term limits. They enshrined me in their rule book by drafting rules to try to stop me. They enshrined me in their laws based on the kind of things I got that nobody else could get. For example, district elections in Omaha for the city council, the school board, the county board. There have been people who served on those bodies who didn't know that, but for me, they wouldn't have been able to get there because they don't study. They're like those kids. We don't need no education. We don't need no thought control. And they're being controlled, and they're getting no education. You can lead the horse to water, but you can't make him drink. You can lead a fool to school, but you can't make him think. Now, I'm going to read you a bit more poetry. That's what other people call it. I call them rhymes. Now, there are Christians who hate LGBTQ plus people. I testified before Congress against what was called DOMA, Defense of Marriage Act, and I said it was unconstitutional. It would have outlawed not only same-sex marriages, they didn't want to do that, but they said no state would have to recognize as valid a marriage conducted in another state. Well, the Constitution has a contract clause where the sanctity, if you want to call it that, of contracts could not be undone. The contract cannot be invalidated in a blanket way. And that's a broad statement. Some things that may be legal in one state won't be legal in another. I'm not talking about that. But at any rate, something like marriage, if it's recognized in one state, it's recognized everywhere. So I spoke against it, what they were trying to do. And as it turns out, the Supreme Court came down, the US Supreme Court, not because of my arguments. I didn't argue before the Supreme Court. The position that I had maintained, that bill that they had, they could enact it, but it would be struck down as unconstitutional. And that is what the US Supreme Court did. I testified before Congress. I had a conflict with President Carter in the White House. So I went against a Republican Congress, a Democratic president, and testified before the UN because I was the first one to get any legislation to take action against investments in companies dealing with South Africa or investments in South Africa. So I testified before Congress. I had confrontation with the president in the White House. I testified before the president's riot commission, as was called. Not only did Ebony do a long spread, but my testimony was discussed by columnists all over the country. Am I boasting? Let me say, I'm like Paul. Paul said, let me boast. Call it what you will. I'm telling the truth. I gave talks before big corporations. I spoke before AT&T executives in New York. And at that time, there was a manufacturing part of the phone industry called Western Electric. And I explained how a guy named Willis Ryan Grover was a racist and the things that he was not doing that he should have done. As it turned out, he wound up getting the boot because those executives listened to me and I made sense. I can read about corporations. I don't have to belong to a corporation or have one to understand the laws that govern the works and dealings of corporations. I can read. I can understand what I read. I remember what I read. When these racists and homophobes, the haters of LGBTQ plus people, were railing against their terms homosexuals so people will know what I'm talking about. So I wrote what I call the homily of the Right Reverend Dr. Falwell Robertson Swaggart. Those are the big shots nationally known. And this is what they were preaching, talking about the, whatever the negative terms are that they applied. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. They walk our streets. They breathe our air. They're under beds and on the stair, like lurking monsters in their lair. They're on the ships. They're in the air. They're working here. They're working there. On railroads taking travelers' fare. Our cars and trucks, they do repair. They just, excuse me. They serve as doctors giving care. They're lawyers seeking progress fair. The garb of nuns and priests they wear. They've infiltrated everywhere. They sat in the electric chair and judges were who sent them there. They may have long, short, or no hair, be homeless or have cash to spare. They may be single or a pair. Some play lion, some the hare. They like their meat well done or rare, and some for veggies only care. They play whist, bridge, and solitaire. No scarlet letter do they wear, nor mark of Cain in forehead bear. Our moral giants ooze despair because they cannot lay them bare, nor snag them in escape-proof snare. To turn our backs we do not dare. So on your guard, beware, beware. They're everywhere, they're everywhere. And I read that to the legislature because there are people with that attitude there. I tried to see things from the standpoint of others, even inanimate objects, even vegetables. You can't see this because it's too small, but it's a picture, and it was from the World Herald 2021, around Christmas time, and big headline, carrying on a tradition. And it shows a huge blue spruce tree. And this is the caption: Omaha's official Christmas tree, a 40-foot blue spruce, waits for its water trough at the Durham Museum on Monday. At top left, a crew from Union Pacific cut down the tree on South 29th Street on Monday morning. Who thinks about how the tree feels about this? Moi. Carrying on a tradition from perdition. Christmas from the tree's perspective, by Ernie Chambers, November 16th, 2021. After I saw the story about them putting this big Christmas tree in the station, and they do it in other places, Times Square, the Capitol building, everywhere. The mighty blue spruce shaded mother doe and baby fawn. Then one day, so tragically, the mighty spruce was gone. For the little spruces, 'twas a mournful, bitter cup. Sadly did they weep. We hope we never do grow up. Human beings viewed the spruce as just another tree. To the little spruces, 'twas a horrid destiny. Christmas time made humans joyful, little trees forlorn. Broken-hearted, they wished Jesus never had been born. Little trees would never know the Jesus irony. When he reached maturity, men nailed him to a tree. I've got a few more minutes, so I'm going to read from a poem that I wrote when I was a youngster, getting out of high school, when I still was grappling with religion. It's called Nero, While Rome Burned. I'm not going to be able to read it all. Bestial Nero was content. The twisted nature in him sated. Gutted by a fire was Rome, the festering, stinking Rome he hated. Lying like a brutalized and ravaged woman at his feet was that mighty city, thousands perished in the flames and heat. Through the city in his flaming boots, grim death had swiftly strode. Nero, Claudius, Drusus Germanicus had a subject for an ode. They said Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Remember, I was in my latter years of high school when I wrote this, because I read even then. The city's heart did throb no more. Those streams of water steady flowing hissed upon it, for it was a furnace vast and brightly glowing. Nero made a point to comfort all the hapless folk of Rome. He extended credit to each man who would rebuild his home. Tax was laid on every province to combat the fire's destruction. Ships brought stores of grain and olives, which were sold at great reduction. Engineers and architects were summoned. Fire-resistant stone was procured by Caesar using currency that was his own. Slaves by thousands set to work to clear the smoking ruins, and then reconstruction was commenced and order was restored again. Rome revived, and Nero smiled, but something lacked, and it was strange, for the Roman populace experienced a striking change. Men grew silent, earnest, unresponsive, sunk in sullen mood. Nothing was availed by Caesar's dole of sour wine and food. Never had the streets played host to such unsmiling, grim-faced men. Rome had altered drastically and was no more what she had been. The imperial criminal did every trick, but all was vain. Men received his gifts and heard his words, but silent did remain. Everywhere that Nero went, he sensed that he had been deserted. Any time that he appeared, the sullen faces were averted. Uselessly, his ready tears were shed. The sorrow he expressed was received by silent Romans who were cold and unimpressed. Rome refused to be enthused. Instead, there welled up like a flood among the masses mutterings that Caesar had spilled Roman blood. Soon suspicion turned to certainty that Nero caused the fire, which had raised, R-A-Z-E-D, that means flattened it, which had raised the Roman city and did now raise Roman ire. Soon the accusation was no longer just a murmur small. It became articulate, expressed by some, then nearly all. Knots of men among the burned out homes and heaps of blackened mortar heard bold voices bitterly proclaim the fire was Caesar's order. It was said that just before the conflagration did begin, many had seen blazing torches being borne by half-clothed men, which they hurled among the slums that bordered on the circus mats, and the close-built ancient structures caught and flared like driest flax. Then the tale was noised abroad that while Rome's lifeblood freely flowed, Nero in a tower on the Esquiline did chant an ode. Part 2. The heart and soul of Rome had altered. Nero saw this painful truth. Men now sought the gods and filled the groves in nearly every booth. Charms were bought and amulets of bronze and silver sold much faster than they could be made, and books were sought, for this profound disaster must have some significance. Great crowds flowed into every temple, worshiping with fervent faith and earnestness, childlike and simple. Roman matrons, in renewal of their ancient worship, vowed to be faithful to the temples, and their haughty spirits bowed. Jupiter was much entreated. Vulcan and the other gods were given offerings, which the priests received with solemn, mournful nods. It grew clearer with each flower wreath and every snowy pigeon offered. Rome was seeing a revival of her old religion. Gradually, Nero comprehended why the populace seemed odd. Every man had turned his face away from Caesar to his God. It was evident the emperor and his advisors had to find a sacrifice to offer to placate the troubled Roman mind. The criminal must hide his crime, to do which many must be killed, in order that the tacit rage of bitter masses might be stilled. Words and gifts alone could calm the slowly swelling storm no more. Sullen men in bitterness recalled that tragic 9-day horror. In the ears of sober men still rang the screams of children and wives who within that glowing furnace that was Rome had lost their lives. Nights were haunted by recurring pictures of loved ones in streets, running panic-stricken to and fro, till wrapped in burning sheets. In their tortured minds, men lived the nightmare once and then again, seeing torches soaked with oil and being borne by half-clothed men. Inevitably, the question raised, who paved the way by pouring wax upon the stores and dwellings that had caught and flared like driest flax? Part 3. Time was now to swing suspicion from Caesar. Fate did give a scapegoat, for the fire bypassed the ghetto where the Jews did live. Though for days the fire had raged and made a shell of much of Rome, not a spark had crossed the Tiber to devour a Jewish home. Strange, all Jewish homes escaped destruction by the roaring flame. Not so difficult a matter here to shift the guilt and blame. Nero and his council labored carefully in preparation, so the people, not the rulers, lodged the fateful accusation. Nero showed himself as tender-hearted. Tears came in a flood, for he had a trick of weeping, and he cried for Jewish blood. Rumor spread as fire had done along each Roman way and street. Soon everyone did blame the Jews. The shift of blame was then complete. No more did the sycophants and pimps and perverts haunt each corner. Rome had shed her royal toga to become a solemn mourner. Tears of profound sorrow from a multitude of eyes did spill. Death mocked with uproarious laughter as he summed his monstrous kill. Men and women, even children, from the greatest to the least, who were Jews or who were Christians, had to meet the savage beast. Raging like wild oxen, stormed the mob and bellowed in their fury. They at once were executioner, infallible judge, and jury. Never did they pause an instant to discern the wrong from right. Any who opposed them fell a victim to their vengeful spite. The Jews, as they have ever done in time of trial, drew near to God, singing psalms until their words resounded from the walls of sod. For this crime, the Jews and Christians equally did share the blame. Some observers noted that they offered prayers that seemed the same. Even though assembly did increase the danger of detection, Christians gathered in appointed places, begging God's protection. Two extremes of mood emerged among these people doomed to die: panic, fear of death in some, in others, joy that death was nigh. Many who were faltering in anguish cried out to the Son, "Help me stand, my Lord and God, and let thy holy will be done." This is when I was a kid in high school, still grappling with religion, and some of the stuff they told me was true about it. When I was a child, I thought as a child, I behaved as a child, I believed as a child. When I became a man, I put away childish things. Some felt great despair, while others indescribable exaltation. For in guise of death, they recognized not death, but their salvation. The fluid line between reality and fantasy was gone. Some knew not precisely what they saw or heard as death came on. Some beheld in the arena beasts, but then to some was given, just before their life drained out, a glimpse of glory that was heaven. Were they sinking as the ground gave way beneath their weary feet, or being lifted up to heaven, their beloved Lord to meet? But in this confusion, when to some the sun was as the moon, one desire was voiced by all: let come what must, but let it happen soon. Many are the causes why men suffer, though most strange and odd. Of causes why men suffer most is faith when questing after God. There are things men will endure with not a whispered sigh or nod. For strange is man in much he does, but most strange when he quests for God. Antonius, the stable boy, had suffered much for his belief. Every form of torture he was made to bear without relief. Every form of torment Roman ingenuity devised, but a faith far stronger than the strongest steel he exercised. He believed, as he'd been taught, that Christ helps all who stand for him. Antonius reached out for this help as his own spark of life grew dim. All that was foretold to him was happening just as foretold. Ye quote, ye shall suffer for his sake, but in your suffering you gain hold on that which ends all suffering. And though you lose all in the strife, you shall march triumphantly past death into eternal life. See what things kids will believe. Bones within his hands. And by the way, this stuff I got from history. The tortures. Bones within his hands and arms and legs had been cracked one by the jaws of iron pincers. When their ghastly work was done, bleeding skin was torn away in bloody strips till quivering flesh, all whitish pink, lay bare. And then a red-hot smoking iron mesh was applied upon the wound and pressed and turned till hissing steam ascended with the stench of burning flesh. Antonius did not scream. I'm going to finish this. I don't have too much, even if I go over a little. Maybe mercy will be extended to me. He had fainted. Merciful unconsciousness shut out all pain. 2 physicians in attendance nursed him conscious once again. One by one, his fingernails had been jerked out by bloody roots. On his feet, which had been flayed, were forced tight-fitting iron boots, which were sunk in beds of glowing, burning coals until they glowed dull red. Not a scream the stable boy did utter, though he tossed his head. Why a man would suffer torture when confession would bring end to his agony, dull Roman conscience could not comprehend. Antonius had been reduced to blistered flesh, burned, torn, and raw. Gaius, master of the house, stared at the spectacle in awe. Never had he seen a man hold firm beneath such brutal pain, never seen one look upon such suffering with such disdain. Witnessing this thing, he stood amazed, and turmoil filled his mind, that a slave would bear such torment, yet would not betray his kind. For one terrible instant, he saw which was man and which was knave. He was filth before the grandeur of this man who was his slave. Suddenly, sickened, angered by the truth brought home to him this day, Gaius seized a scourge, and in blind fury he did fiercely flay that bruised, half-conscious, bloody form that was the hapless stable boy. All the watchers stared, amazed. The master he himself would employ with his own royal hand the scourge until Antonius lost all consciousness and slumped and lay completely still. Gaius let his flailing arm fall limp against his heaving side. Every watcher then was sure the stable boy at last had died. Gaius summoned his physicians with their medicines and balm. Bring this slave to consciousness. The master then once more was calm. Skillful hands applied the medicines and oils, and in a while the bleeding bundle stirred, and Master Gaius, he did faintly smile. Let the torture be resumed, he cried. It was to be supposed the slave must yield, but he would not. His eyes were shut, his mouth stayed closed. Then here comes the mysticism. Through the fiery rings that wheeled above his head, he counted 7 flights of marble steps which mounted upward from the earth to heaven. At the summit of the stairs, above a wide platform was seen a figure shimmering in the midst of luminous clouds of bluish sheen. Don't tell me I didn't bring it all. The figure stood with arms outstretched to him, and tears of joy he wept as he mounted heavenward in agony, step by painful step. Copious tears streamed unashamed. The stable boy had no more shame, for all the suffering he endured had bound him closer to that name. Every pang of pain was dear to him. Each time the iron claws bit and tore into his flesh and bone, he tighter clenched his jaws. The hotter burned the fire beneath his crippled feet. The joy he knew swelled, for closer came that glory toward him from the clouds of blue. Then he felt upon his burning feet the marble steps' cool touch, and he was aware of slowly slipping from his agony's clutch. Then the steps themselves did yield and soften, and themselves became like unto the clouds about him, made of stuff that was the same. Now the figure radiant drew nearer as he floated higher. All was coolness, for the heat had been extracted from the fire. On from cradle, onto cradle, by the clouds he slowly passed, till he reached the place where all the blueness and great radiance massed. Then from out the inmost blue, there stepped his Savior, and a bliss overwhelmed the stable boy. The misty blue did gently kiss his wounds and soothed all pain and healed his frame, and it was passing grand. Antonius reached responsive arms and grasped his Savior's outstretched hand. A smile was on the Savior's lips and deep compassion in his eye. His gentle voice and tone, "Come home, my son, you've suffered as did I." "Take me, Lord, my suffering has not been in vain. Take me to thee." Gaius and the watchers gawked, were thunderstruck, for none could see nor comprehend the mystery that wrought within that broken heap. So they stared in startled silence as Antonius fell asleep. As the canary said when told that the cage door was ajar, "I'm out of here."
Thank you for watching The Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to make suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This has been an EWC Communication production.